Good evening. This is Real Talk, History as a Weapon for Black Liberation, and I'm your host, Dr. Sundiata Kaita Chajua. Today's guest is Dr. Brian Kwoba. He is an associate professor and director of African and African American Studies at the University of Memphis. He received his BA in philosophy in 2004 from Cornell University, an MA in teaching, and there is a parenthesis political science. So we're going to have to dig into that. And his PhD is from Tufts. The MA is from Tufts University in 2007, and he is the 2017 recipient of a PhD in history from the University of Oxford. His research interests include African American political thought, social movements, and the politics of race, class, and gender across the African diaspora. Along with Rose Chatuluke and Gamso Nkopo, he edited Roads Must Fall, The Struggle to Decolonize the Racist Heart of Empire, published by Zed Press in 2018. He has written extensively, more than I think anyone else, on New Movement radical Hubert Harrison, whom A. Philip Randolph described as the, quote, father of Harlem radicalism, unquote. His work on Harrison has culminated in his recently released book, Hubert Harrison, Forbidden Genius of Black Radicalism, published, I believe, just a few weeks ago by University of North Carolina Press. So, Brian, welcome.
Thank you so much, Brother Sunjata. It's a pleasure to be here.
And it's a pleasure to have you. I don't know if you've watched episodes of Real Talk, but we try and keep it fairly simple and informal. So we operate with brother and sister and first names as opposed to titles. We try and have a conversation. I'm the kind of person who will interject. Some will say interrupt. But the idea is to have as lively a dialogue as possible. So I'm also a devotee of William Bill Cross, the main person in the development of African American identity, who developed the Negrescence framework. And, Bill was a good friend, and he passed a few months ago. And so I always like to begin with a moment of silence for Bill. So let's take a moment of silence.
May he rest in power.
Okay, Brother Brian. So we always try and begin with biographical information. So if you can tell me where you were born, where you spent your formative years, and what historical period are we talking about in which you came of age, and what's the class background of your family, and was your family engaged in activism?
Great questions. So I was born in Manchester, Connecticut, grew up mostly in Boulder, Colorado, the few years spent in Cincinnati, Ohio. And then I ended up going to Cornell, upstate New York, for undergrad. And my mother, she's retired now, but she was a teacher for her career. She taught high school, middle school, some elementary school, and she was a teacher of foreign languages. So I think that's why I have such a sort of emphasis on teaching and passion for teaching, because I literally got the teaching bug, so to speak, with my mother's milk. My dad is Kenyan, and I didn't really grow up much around my dad. My mother was mostly a single mother during my upbringing. So I've had a sort of not just a working class background, but also a certain kind of class consciousness about that, at least from high school. Though I have to say, I was quite apolitical really until my senior year of college, when I went to Cuba. Actually, the summer right before my senior year at Cornell, I went to Cuba for a few weeks.
Let me slow you down for a moment. So, what made you go to Cuba? That just doesn't seem like.
So I was
an apolitical person wakes up one morning and says, "Let me go see Cuba."
Right. Yeah, no, it's funny. Yeah, most people who go to Cuba are already somewhat politically conscious. I was actually interested in studying music. I was super into jazz, particular jazz piano. I was, playing in the Cornell University jazz ensembles, but also playing off campus, at restaurants and bars and gigs for different occasions. And I was part of this undergraduate research scholars program at Cornell, which had funding for undergraduates to do research projects. And so by the time I got to my junior year, I was like, I need to do something with this funding. Let me go study jazz, Latin jazz in Cuba, because I love Latin jazz, as part of my love of jazz more generally. And so I get to Cuba and it's summertime. I went like in July. So all the music conservatories were closed. It was difficult even to find private instruction on piano. So I ended up shifting my musical focus to the music that I heard walking the streets of Havana, particularly the Afro-Cuban folkloric traditions like rumba and bata, which planted seeds for a certain kind of decolonization or perhaps African re-indigenization that would blossom much later in life. But it also planted seeds of political consciousness because, the experience of being in Cuba, even though I was not there for political reasons or purposes, raised a number of political questions that my 20-year-old self was not able to answer. And so when I got back from Cuba for my senior year, I took a couple of courses, political science courses that helped me to sort of begin to radicalize and kind of open up my mind politically to why it is that, the US, for example, was imposing this relentless blockade and embargo on Cuba, given that it was over a decade after the Cold War at that point. I didn't understand that, I didn't understand a whole number of things that I experienced in Cuba, but that's really what the spark for my political awakening was.
And so that was the spark. And so what is the actual activism that you engaged in? And can you give us the time period that we're talking about here?
Yeah, so I went to Cuba in the summer of 2003. Just a few months after the launching of the Iraq War under George W. Bush and Tony Blair. And just to show you how apolitical I was, I remember very clearly not actually having any opinion about that. I was neither for the war, nor was I against the war. I literally just had no strong opinion one way or the other, which is funny to say now, given my subsequent trajectory. But when I got back from Cuba, and I had all these political questions. The fall semester I took these courses, and I had a couple radical professors who helped me to sort of connect with some more radical thinkers in literature. For example, I remember reading Howard Zinn's People's History. I remember reading Chomsky and getting into Noam Chomsky, and then my spring semester of senior year, last semester, the International Socialist Organization started a branch at Cornell University, which I joined. And so I joined, a socialist, Marxist, Trotskyist organization in which I learned a whole bunch of Marxist theory, working class politics, and revolutionary history, which just sort of helped catalyze and guide my radicalization at that particular time. And of course, I ended up leaving the organization a few years later, but it left a lot of lasting lessons. And I just last weekend was in Chicago for the Socialism 2025 conference, a conference that I had not attended for literally 16 years since I was last in the ISO. And so it was a nice moment because, I was able to present my new book on Hubert Harrison, which people can see here if they've not already. I was able to come back. It was like a homecoming, when you visit your old elementary school or your old high school or whatever. It felt like that, and I was just really excited to be back in a socialist space, connecting with people like Robin D.G. Kelly, who joined me in conversation for my book presentation. It was a packed room. We sold out of all the books that I brought. And so, yeah, I'm just really excited that people are taking to this work and showing such enthusiasm for it.
Good. So I now want to pick on something that I think is kind of unique in your background. As I mentioned, your BA is in philosophy. Now, was it political philosophy? What branch of philosophy did you focus on?
I would say it was just kind of the standard, undergrad, mostly, overwhelmingly European philosophy. As an undergrad, I didn't even know there was such a thing as Black philosophy or Africana philosophy or philosophy of race, for example. I didn't know that there were other branches of philosophy. So I studied, Descartes and Socrates and Plato and like kind of all the kind of canonical European thinkers, the stale pale males, as it were.
Yeah. Okay, but then you go and you do the MA in teaching. And what is the political science that's in parentheses behind your teaching?
That was the specialization. So I did a master's in teaching at Tufts, and at that time you could specialize in sort of subfields of teaching. So I took political science as my specialization just because, by that time I was, an activist. I was very politically conscious and wanted to adopt that focus because I wanted to teach in order to give back to the community and in order to open minds and show students things that I hadn't been shown when I was, in high school. And so, I decided, let me see if I can teach. Let me see if I can be a high school teacher. I ended up teaching high school after the master's in teaching. And I loved it because it was an opportunity for me to connect with students who never liked history. Students like me, I never liked history. When I was in middle school, high school, I didn't even take a single history course as an undergraduate, right? Because I just thought history.
Roll back here. Now, James Lowen once told me, and it's also in his book, Lies My Teacher Told Me, that the surveys he did, and we're talking the 80s now, it turned out that history was the most disliked course by African-American students. So was that your experience in high school?
Yeah. I mean, the only other subject I probably hated more was chemistry because I just never understood it. But yeah, history meant nothing to me. I literally thought history was a dead letter. It was in the past. It was only when I became an activist that second semester of my senior year at Cornell, beginning to become active against the war in Iraq at that time. That's when I started to realize the value of history because, history explains how the world got to be the way it is. And if you want to change something, anything, it's really helpful to know how it got to be the way that it is.
It absolutely is. And so then you go get the PhD in history. And was there any kind of plan in the move from disciplinary foci to disciplinary foci, or was it things that were happening on the ground in your life at that moment that pushed you into the different disciplines?
Yeah, it was just part of my own trajectory, my own journey intellectually, because before I went back for my PhD, I was teaching high school history, world history and U.S. history at the Cambridge Rindge and Latin School, the only big public high school in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And to make a long story short, a story which, by the way, I tell in my preface of the book for people who want to learn more about it. I got fired for my politics, and that's what ultimately, caused me to go back for the PhD, because I thought, I would just teach high school for my career, because I liked the school, I liked the students, I liked my coworkers, but the administration was really hostile to some of the activism I was doing, including with students. For example, taking students to Washington D.C. for national protest marches and stuff like that. They didn't like that. So right on the cusp of me getting tenure in the Cambridge public school system, they wrote me a negative evaluation, which became the reason to not renew my contract. And it was just clear. It was clear to me that it was a political decision. They didn't want, somebody doing activism and politics to be teaching in the school. So that's ultimately what made me go back for my PhD, because I still wanted to teach, but I realized I wanted to teach undergrads because I appreciated, teaching high schoolers, and I knew that undergrads would be even more fun, given that they have a little more life experience. They're a little more mature, right, than high school students, and so that's ultimately why I ended up going back for my doctorate.
So now there's something that I'm picking up. You haven't mentioned courses in Black Africana Studies. So as an undergrad or an MA student, or I don't know if they have Black Studies at Oxford. Did you take Black Studies courses?
Not much. Another funny story there. While I was an undergrad at Cornell, I began to take a course with the late great Dr. James Turner, one of the founding figures of the Africana Studies program at Cornell. And I lasted about a week or maybe a week and a half, and I couldn't handle it. I literally dropped the course because it was just so far over my head and so beyond my consciousness, both politically and racially, that I couldn't even hang. And so it's funny now, I'm a director of African and African American Studies at the University of Memphis. So I grew a lot since that moment. But the ISO, being in the socialist organization, that was the first sort of taste I got of learning a bit more deeply about things like the civil rights movement, Black Power, Malcolm X, Dr. King. And then especially after I left the ISO, one of the first things I did, because I'd found out about CLR James's Black Jacobins while I was still in the group, even though we never read it, I read that book. And when I read, the Black Jacobins, it was kind of a life-changing experience, because here's a Black revolution in Haiti of formerly enslaved people literally defeating all the most powerful empires of their day, including, Napoleon's army. And it really opened up a whole new world of things. So when I got involved in activism subsequently in the Occupy Wall Street movement, for example, I was in Boston, so I was part of Occupy Boston. We had a people of color working group within Occupy Boston. And I also helped to launch some of the sort of satellite initiatives, Occupy the Hood in Roxbury, as well as Ocupemos el Barrio in East Boston. And so, yeah, from then on, I had a much deeper racial consciousness. And of course, as a person of Kenyan descent, I started traveling to Kenya as well after my experiences in graduate school, and began to explore my Kenyan and African identities, which of course, got me curious about Pan-Africanism, Black internationalism, Black liberation, and themes like that.
Yeah, because I was a little bit struck when you mentioned that a couple of the first really political books you read was Howard Zinn and Noam Chomsky. That's not generally the path for Black radicals, but I get it. So I want to now kind of move to a paper you did that had an interesting title. It was a conference presentation, and you kind of riffed on Frantz Fanon's famous observation in The Wretched of the Earth, where he says that Marxist analysis should always be slightly stretched every time we have to do with the colonial problem. And so you have put in intensive work and published a very, very good book on Hubert Harrison. And I think it would be fair to say, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but Harrison is not just part of that generation that creates what I'm going to call Black radicalism in the context of capitalism and imperialism. And what I'm trying to get at is this. The radicalism of a Frederick Douglass, right, dealing with enslavement is abolition now.
Yep.
That is not the kind of radicalism that can speak to the late 19th, early 20th century in the current moment, right? Because it's not focused on the question of capitalism and particularly monopoly capitalism, right? So Harrison is one of the first Black folk, and I think you and Perry, Jeffrey Perry, are correct. He's leading the charge in terms of Black people who are developing a radical perspective that begins to look at the African American, the African diasporan, the world Black global situation in relationship to capitalism, colonialism, and imperialism. So
yes.
I'd like you to do, I refer to this as race-conscious Marxism, taking the lead from C.L.R. James. And one of the things that I find interesting is that James, when he wrote the Black Jacobins, his intention was to write about the Haitian Revolution in order to provide an instructive manual to Africans who were preparing to lead anti-colonial struggles. I believe I read or heard you say that writing the work on Harrison was also meant to provide direction and guidance for contemporary struggles. Can you elaborate on that?
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. So, I really wrote this book not primarily with a scholarly audience in mind, although of course it is a scholarly book and it's on a university press. I really tried to write for an audience beyond the academy, for activists, for community organizers, for people who are doing that kind of work on the ground, because that's how I got into this. As I mentioned, it wasn't until I became an activist that I started to care about history. And so I think Harrison's life and legacy, because he was such a groundbreaking and multidimensional figure in the Black radical tradition, and because he's been so scandalously marginalized and ignored, there's a lot we can still learn from Harrison. Just like in Harrison, just like we have billionaire oligarchs today, for example, in Harrison's day, you had the so-called robber barons of the Gilded Age, right? The billionaire oligarchs like Rockefeller and Carnegie and J.P. Morgan, who were the white monopoly capitalists that really ruled over the economy and the government. You had the era of World War I during Harrison's day, which he analyzed as an imperialist war, right? We have plenty of imperialism going on and wars today. You had, of course, Jim Crow racial oppression in Harrison's day. We have plenty of racial oppression, white nationalism, anti-Black violence today. So I tried to, although it's a book of history, I really tried to write in such a way that allows that history to speak to the present. In other words, telling a story that offers a very usable past, because a lot of the forces that Harrison was fighting against, we are still fighting now. But too often we do it without learning the lessons from past generations. And so I wrote this book as not only a recovery or reclamation of Harrison and his legacy, but also as a kind of political handbook for activists today who want to more deeply understand questions of capitalism, racism, white supremacy, gender and sexuality repression, religion, science and technology, labor, love. It's a very, wide-ranging book, and I would love to hear more about, what you made of the book. But yeah, I really tried to make it an offering that would be useful for people far beyond the academy. Speak to people far beyond the academy, just like Harrison did.
So this idea of a race-conscious Marxism, drawing on the work of Harrison, Fanon, Du Bois, James, Claudia Jones, Louise Thompson. I want you to contrast that with what Uday Jain has called white Marxism. And I think it would be fair to say that most of the white-led left parties are engaged in a white Marxist project.
Yeah.
And I'm surmising that that's one of the reasons you left the ISO, right? And so can you speak to that contrast and, of course, rooted in the Harrison?
Absolutely. Well, everything gets better when you blacken it, right? Anti-colonial politics get better when you blacken them. Feminism gets better when you blacken it. Marxism gets better when you blacken it. And it's not just that it gets better, but there's a paradigm shift that happens, right? Because Harrison is one of the figures, among others, who argued very clearly to the Socialist Party, to the white left or the white Marxists, that the Black population in this country, in the United States, is more thoroughly proletarian than any other. And it's not difficult to understand why that is, right? Africans were brought here to work, to be laborers, right? And so
let me write that now, because I agree with you, but the white left at that time, I don't know that they would have considered sharecropping and maybe not even farm labor in general as a proletarian.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think they would have.
Right. Well, that's
Harrison's argument.
Well, it's true. I mean, and this is why the work of Black Marxism is so important, right? Because it's not just Harrison; it's C.L.R. James and the Black Jacobins. He's arguing that the enslaved population of Haiti is a proletarian, is a working class under capitalism. Same thing with Du Bois and Black.
Then he say it is that the enslaved population was the most thoroughly proletarianized folk; that it was damn near factory-like labor.
Right. And this is exactly why W.E.B. Du Bois and Black Reconstruction also starts with the Black worker, right? So just like Harrison did, both C.L.R. James and Du Bois are taking the Black worker as their starting point, as opposed to the white Marxists who took the white worker as their starting point. And Marx, by the way, had very relatively very little to say about the figure of the enslaved Black worker compared to the industrial white worker, right?
Are you talking in terms of quantity, or are you talking in terms of incisive commentary? Because I would argue that Marx originates capitalism with the slave trade, with the colonization, and what's the phrase? The entombment in the minds of the Aboriginal people of the Americas, the turning of Africa into the hunting. Warrant for the hunting of black skins, and the East India trade, that he sees that as the origin of capital. He doesn't see the origin of capital in British factories. He doesn't see the origin of capital in the aristocracy taking control of the forest and public land. He roots it in that international exchange. And if you go through Capital and you go through some of the other works of Marx, even this question about where one starts, right? He says that you start with the human. And if you look at much of what he has to say, he does start with the slave, with enslavement. So I think that that's a Western Marxist reading of Marx that is actually quite wrong. That's one of the reasons why we have to just say, MF those white socialist parties.
Well, yeah, I mean, you could argue on that basis that white Marxists have abandoned Marx by failing to place the black worker at the center of their analysis, because what Harrison tried to do, Du Bois, C.L.R. James, Cedric Robinson, we've all been saying, hey, you should actually be taking the black worker as your theoretical and practical starting point. If you're serious about addressing capitalism. And so the fact that they haven't done that, even though they can see how and why black workers are more thoroughly the black population is more thoroughly proletarian and also more ruthlessly exploited, right? Lower wages, worse conditions, generally speaking, than the average white worker. You would think that if you're in an organization committed to proletarian emancipation, right, or the liberation of the working class, you would start, if not devote more attention to black workers than white workers. But okay, that's not what's happened. And so I'm sorry to say that we still are once again, we're still dealing with the same challenges that Harrison did, right? Because you have a lot of white leftists and socialists today who can't handle the idea that they're not the center of the universe, right? And that in fact, your politics would be more radical and more effective if you could see the black working class as a more central factor in the construction of capitalism, much like you said Marx did, and as a theoretical and practical sort of starting point that actually illuminates more about capitalism when you start there, versus if you try to start with the white worker and then bring all these other questions in afterwards. And Harrison was very critical of the Socialist Party and wasn't able to stay because he was trying to get them to take the race question and black workers more seriously. And they essentially poo-pooed the idea and actually turned against him and drove him out of the party. So, and that's been the experience of many black people, black radical figures in the socialist and communist parties, which is that they get excited about the idea of revolution. They get excited about the idea of challenging capitalism, imperialism, and then they find out that the organization they've joined has very serious limitations in its race politics, which makes it hard for them to stay, right? We could talk about a whole number of black radical figures who have been in and then out of the left for this reason.
Well, one of the interesting stories is Peter H. Clark, right? Peter Humphreys Clark joins the Socialist Party in 1878, I believe. No, 1877. And by 1878, so he's the first person to join the Socialist Party, and he's also the first black person to leave.
Yeah, the two seem to go hand in hand. It reminds me of the joke that says, marriage is the leading cause of divorce.
So, what are the silences that Harrison makes audible?
Well, we've just talked about one of the silences, which is the silence of the white left or white Marxism on questions of black liberation, or maybe not silence, but at least marginalization. Other silences, one big one is the relationship of black communities to Christianity and religion more generally, right? Harrison was a very prominent black free thinker. In fact, the most prominent black free thinker of his generation. He wrote for publications like The Truth Seeker, the main free thought publication, and he sought a complete separation of church and state, right? Getting the Bible out of the courtroom, getting chaplains out of the military, getting prayers out of school. Harrison also makes audible the silence of the question of sexuality, and in particular, the regime of compulsory monogamy, which says that the maximum number of sexual partners anyone's allowed to have in the society is one. Harrison argued that we are not monogamists by nature, but by compulsion from the state and the church and capital. He's, as far as I can tell, the first figure in African-American history to not only defend free love and the idea that we're not monogamous by nature, but to denounce church and state repression of sexuality and to call for the decriminalizing of access to contraception and to offer a public-facing series of lectures on sex education. And I think this is one of the most perhaps controversial, but also generative dimensions of Harrison's legacy, because he was able to connect capitalism and imperialism and white supremacy with compulsory monogamy, right? Seeing how indigenous peoples all over the world did not necessarily make monogamy the center of the universe when it comes to sex, love, and marriage. But after European conquest of the world and domination of the world, that's the era, the past 500 years, where monogamy has become this kind of superior form of relationship, and all else is illegitimate or illegible. And of course, there's the period of what we could call the so-called Harlem Renaissance, where there's a lot of experimentation by Black creatives, not just in the arts, but also in sexualities, which, Harrison was part of that milieu in Harlem, and in many ways gave voice to the pragmatic, practical, on the ground, different forms of erotic energy exchange that people were experimenting with. And I think this is really almost like a new frontier for radical thought, right? Because even when you look at Black queer studies, Black queer liberation, right? There's a lot of critique about heteronormativity, about homophobia, right? But there's very little in the way of systematic interrogation of compulsory monogamy. And so I think that's something that we just haven't done very much. We haven't done enough, right? And so part of what I'm recovering about Harrison, because no one else has written about this aspect of Harrison's thought with any depth, is really looking at, okay, why has there been such a silence, even for folks who are talking about sexuality, right, and liberation? Why has there been such a silence on the question of monogamy, right? If we're challenging compulsory heteronormativity, why aren't we challenging compulsory monogamy?
Okay, so you've identified two very important areas in which Harrison stood out as a radical. Is there anything else you want to say that made Harrison not unique but distinctive in terms of his radicalism in his era?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the things that's most distinctive about Harrison is his multidimensionality, right? He wasn't just a Black Marxist or socialist. He wasn't just a Black free thinker. He wasn't just a Black free lover. He wasn't just a radical Black internationalist and Pan-Africanist. He was all of these things and more, because when you combine these different radicalisms together, you actually can see new angles of vision. When you try to integrate these different frameworks, you can actually see new possibilities for transformation that otherwise might be there. Because any single political framework, whether it's Marxism, whether it's feminism, whether it's Afro-pessimism, whatever it is, any single framework is almost by definition not really going to be able to capture the whole totality of the complexity of life and reality for folks. And so we need to integrate and synthesize multiple different streams of radical thinking. And Harrison, he I'll tell a quick story. When he was advising young people about how to get education, he used to tell them, yes, go get whatever education you can in schools, but also get education in movements, social movements, and on the corner and outside and anywhere you can. And he said, don't believe you know something unless you've tested it against 10 other people who know differently and you've survived the shock. So yeah, so it's a beautiful method, and something that forced me to learn a lot more than I otherwise would have if I didn't study Harrison. Harrison really kicked me in the pants in a lot of ways, or sent me to the woodshed, if I can use a jazz head analogy, because I didn't know anything about the historiography of free thinkers, let alone Black free thinkers. You know, I didn't know anything about the historiography of the free love movement, you know, and the European American sex radical tradition, let alone Black free love. There were just these whole areas of inquiry that I did not know much about. And so by studying Harrison, you know, he forced me to learn, in learning more about his multidimensionality, I learned about some of these other radical traditions that have a lot to offer, you know, when we're thinking about the sort of algebra of revolution, right? The larger puzzle or constellation of factors and forces that are necessary to contend with if we really want to get free.
So Brian, you could have presumably selected Peter Humphreys Clark, although Nikki Taylor had already done the book, but there's no biography of Cyril Briggs. There's Richard Moore's wife's book on him, but there's no scholarly book on Richard Moore. I don't think there's a book on Louise Thompson. So there was a range of people you could have chosen, right? So what led you to Harrison in particular?
Great question.
And I got to say this, you know, my guy, Langston, right? What we got ain't all that good.
Yeah, well, this is a great question. And by the way, there is a book on Louise Thompson Patterson by Keith Gilliard, which people can check out if they're curious. But yeah, what led me to Harrison was that I discovered him towards the end of, very near the end of my tenure in the ISO, in the socialist group that I mentioned. And I saw Jeff Perry. I saw a review of Jeff Perry's book. You know, Jeff Perry being the only other scholar that I'm aware of that has produced book-length treatments on Harrison. And I have to say, by the way, I'm building on the foundation that Perry laid. Absolutely. You know, he's written a 2-volume biography and a book of Harrison's writings. So once I learned about Perry's work and I read the first volume of his biography, that was back in 2009, I was like, man, Harrison is a fascinating figure. And why does nobody know about him? Why didn't I know about him? You know? So that's what ultimately set me down the path. And I would learn about some of the other people you mentioned, obviously, through studying Harrison, right? Cyril Briggs, Richard B. Moore, Grace Campbell, Wilfred Domingo, right? And Harrison influenced all of them. Harrison is this key kind of linchpin turning point for the Black radical tradition because he secularizes the Black socialist politics that those who came before him had, right? Peter Clark, you mentioned Peter Clark. Yes, he's a pioneering Black socialist.
Elaborate on this. So you're saying that before Harrison, the Blacks who were socialists were operating out of the Christian socialist tradition? You're saying
they were Christians.
George,
they were Christians.
Washington and Annie Woodby and Slater, that was that trend. Yep. Black Christian socialism was the dominant form that Black socialism took prior to Harrison?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, Peter Clark, Reverend George Slater, right? Reverend George Washington Woodbey and his wife Annie Woodbey, who was an activist and thinker. These are Black socialists, but they're Christians. They're churchgoers. They're in that fold, right? Whereas Harrison is a free thinker. He has broken with Christianity. He identifies himself as an agnostic. And he's ruthlessly critical, not just of Christianity, but of religion more generally. And so that's something that, again, when we're thinking about Black Marxism, what's one of the major differences between a kind of Black Marxist politic and what had come before is the secular aspect of it, right? There's no room for religion in Karl Marx, who obviously famously said religion is the opium of the people, right? And so that's,
there's a broader quote there.
Yeah.
You know, there's a broader quote. So we don't want to just leave it as that, right?
Right. That's fair. And I can share the quote if you want, because it's illuminating. The rest of the quote, you're right. We usually don't say it. It often gets left out, right? But what Marx says, just to give the full quote, he says, the criticism of religion is the prerequisite of all criticism. Religious suffering is, at one and the same time, the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. The demand for abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people is the demand for their real happiness. To call on them to give up their illusions about their condition is to call on them to give up a condition that requires illusions. And so, Harrison, I think in many ways exemplifies this quote in the sense that, once he broke with religion, it opened the door for him to have a radical, reassessment of a whole number of other things. And another example of how Harrison is kind of a turning point for the Black radical tradition is also in his relationship to Africa and African people. Right. So, yes, there's a Black nationalist tradition that identified somewhat with Africa going back to the 19th century. But a lot of those folks, most of them had a paternalistic view of Africa and Africans. So someone like Martin Delany, for example, who coined the slogan Africa for the Africans, we often forget the rest of what he said, which is Africa for the Africans and Black men to rule them, meaning that Western Blacks in the diaspora needed to come to Africa and uplift them or civilize them or develop them in some way, shape, or form, which assumes that Africans, didn't have that capacity themselves. Harrison breaks fundamentally with that by saying, hey, our task in the diaspora is not to teach or develop, but to learn from Africans and see what they have to teach us.
And that is absolutely a very unique position for Black folks, African Americans, and other Black folk in the diaspora to take.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely, that is a break. So those are the things that you would identify as the major contributions, the major building blocks that Harrison puts together in terms of building a radical Black Marxist labor tradition. But I still want you to put him in dialogue with those, with someone like Briggs and the ABB. I know he influences them, but he doesn't join the ABB.
Right. Harrison influenced that whole first generation of Black communists. Harrison was one of their key influences because he paved the way, as I said, for a secular Black socialist politics in the Socialist Party, which they were able to kind of build off of. First in the Socialist Party with A. Philip Randolph, Chandler Owen, Grace Campbell, right? And then when they leave the Socialist Party and found the ABB, Cyril Briggs, Grace Campbell, Wilfred Domingo, Richard B. Moore, they are basically trying to build a kind of independent, revolutionary Black socialist / nationalist or internationalist politics. And Harrison, there's moments where Harrison worked with those Black communists in Harlem. But when the Communist Party approached Harrison to join, or to be, as Robert Hill put it, to be their stalking horse against Garvey, Harrison's kind of keeping the Communist Party at arm's length because, as I said in the book, Harrison and the white left, he was once bitten, twice shy, right? Once he had this negative experience in the Socialist Party, trying to deal with the white Marxism or white leftist politics that they had, he could feel that the Communist Party, was doing something similar that he didn't quite feel comfortable with. He wanted to maintain himself as an independent Black thinker and activist, not to accept funding and the strings that are often attached with funding from white radicals. And so, when we're thinking about the Garvey movement, for example, Harrison, we'll talk more about this in a second, but there's a moment in 1921 in the lead up to the Second International UNIA Convention where Harrison convenes a meeting of the Black Reds in Harlem. Claude McKay was there, Cyril Briggs was there, Grace Campbell was there. And the purpose of the meeting, as McKay recounts in his autobiography, was to see if they could make the Garvey movement more class conscious, right? In other words, seeing if it was possible to actually build a kind of, anti-capitalist or socialist analysis and politic within the UNIA, Universal Negro Improvement Association. That didn't work, as we know, right? And Garvey ends up summarily expelling the ABB.
But it did look like for a moment, didn't it look like it could have worked
It could have, but Garvey, Garvey was he was the HNIC, right? To put it simply, he wanted to be the head Negro in charge of the UNIA. And so, when they roll up on that conference in 1921, the ABB, they attend the Second International Convention of the UNIA and really try to intervene and like push it. And Garvey has them all expelled summarily. Yeah, and I think that's a real turning point, because after that moment, Garveyism and Garvey are seemingly quite at odds with Black socialist and communist thinkers.
I think it's always clear that Garvey, despite saying things like no one should own more than $5 million, which is a hell of a sum back then, but despite saying things like that, I think it's clear Garvey was always on the right side of the ledger.
Well, certainly after 1921, he was.
Absolutely after 1921.
Before 1921, there's moments where you might. Before 1921, there's some examples of Garvey's openness. For example, Garvey allowed even some white radicals like Eugene Debs and Rose Pastor Stokes to address UNIA gatherings. Right, Garvey's the Negro World newspaper, which Garvey, which was the paper of the Garvey movement. The first editor was Wilfred Domingo, a socialist, right? The second editor was Hubert Harrison, or one of the other early editors was Hubert Harrison, a Black socialist, right? Garvey even sent a message to Lenin, congratulating Lenin and Trotsky for their struggle against despotism in Russia. So there are these moments where Garvey appears to be at least open to socialist thinkers and figures, but after 1921, that kind of goes the way of the dinosaur, and he's much less interested in that. But if I can back up a little bit and just talk about one of the most underappreciated, I want to speak to Garveyists for a moment, because one of the most underappreciated aspects of Harrison's impact and legacy is his role in decisively catalyzing the rise of Garvey and Garveyism by founding the Liberty League of Negro Americans, right? So Garvey's in 1914, when Garvey and Amy Ashwood, his partner and then first wife, when they found the UNIA, their original plan was to set up a Tuskegee-style institute in Jamaica, right? An industrial school in Jamaica. And Garvey's writing letters to Booker T. Washington, trying to get funding, trying to get support. When Garvey gets to Harlem, he joins Harrison's Liberty League. And it's Harrison's Liberty League that is talking about race first, that's talking about a mass movement, right? Rather than an industrial school. It's Harrison's Liberty League that's talking about a tricolor flag for Black liberation, right? The Liberty League had a black, brown, and yellow flag symbolizing peoples of color of the world and their relationship, which is the sort of predecessor to the red, black, and green of the Garvey movement, right? And so there's all these elements of the Liberty League that Garvey learns from Harrison, right? From the Liberty League, and he uses and adopts in order to build the UNIA into the largest organization of African people in modern history, right? There would be no Garvey or Garveyism as we know them without the decisive impact of Harrison, especially this conversion in Garvey's vision from building a Tuskegee-style school in Jamaica to building a transnational organization of African people that is part of a mass movement, right? Like that is a key way in which Harrison, as I said, catalyzes the rise of Garvey and Garveyism.
Doesn't Harrison bring Garvey in as a speaker early on?
Yes. Garvey's, yep.
But also in terms of what you describe as the University of the Streets, the street corner speakers that Ralph Crowder so famously about. Can you go back and pick up, is Harrison the person who innovates that type of public discourse, or is he just folding into a tradition that was there?
Yeah, Harrison is blazing a trail. He is a spearhead of what becomes a larger tradition of street corner speaking in Harlem. Even before Harlem was the Black Mecca that it became, Harrison was speaking on street corners. For example, in September of 1912, almost exactly a century before Occupy Wall Street, Harrison occupied the attention of a massive crowd of people right in front of the New York Stock Exchange. What was he speaking about? He was speaking about socialism, the case for socialism, right? And he spoke for 3 hours until his voice got hoarse, and people were drawing closer and closer as his voice got, more and more hoarse. So he was a renowned speaker and orator, one of, by all accounts, both, scholarly accounts and contemporaries who witnessed him at the time. He was one of the greatest orators that people had ever seen. And so he brings those skills to Harlem, and he essentially helps to found the tradition of stepladder oratory, which I have a whole chapter on this in the book, because it's such a fascinating social phenomenon that really didn't really exist in Harlem prior to that moment. And it was a whole culture of outdoor engagement and call and response between the orator and the audience. I mean, you have to remember, there was no internet at this time in the 1910s and 20s. There was no television in the 1910s and 20s. There wasn't even black radio. I mean, whatever radio there was, it was 99% white programming. And if they had a black thing, it was like blackface radio, right? Like it was minstrelsy.
Yeah. Oh, it was definitely minstrelsy. Yeah. Yeah.
So social life was lived in person, and it was lived on the street.
So
say it again.
I want you to go and say you've talked about Harrison basically creating a platform for Garvey, but can you talk more about, did they also fall out in 21?
Yeah.
We know when they kicked out the ABB, when they attempt to push it to the left, Harrison, other than that meeting, he doesn't really play a role in that political thrust, right? That's Briggs in the ABB.
Yeah, Harrison. That was toward the end of Harrison's tenure in the Garvey movement. That was what you might call a last-ditch effort for Harrison, because already by May of 1920, just about 5 months after he started working as the editor of Garvey's Negro World newspaper, Harrison records a number of diary entries which demonstrate he's already really skeptical about Garvey, and has a number of criticisms and grievances of Garvey that would, of course, only grow as time went on, the rest of 1920 and into 1921. For example, for one example, Harrison was incensed about what he called the insane egotism of Garvey, right? That Garvey had to be the center of the universe, was sort of coveting the limelight in particular ways, and was jealous of any subordinates that were independent or successful, or that weren't yes men for Garvey. Harrison was concerned about Garvey's propensity for lying magnificently, grandiloquently, about the size of the UNI membership, about the size of the First International Convention, the way in which Garvey, basically stacked a number of votes at that first convention to put his subordinates and his henchmen into positions of power. Harrison, there's a note that Harrison writes in his diary where he says it's a grievance or a gripe that he has with Garvey. He says changed program from Negro self-help to invasion of Africa, right? And so this idea that Garvey had to go into Liberia and set up a UNIA colony in Liberia. Harrison was like, we don't need to be colonizing other places. Like, we need to get free here. And Africans, the task of African liberation belongs to Africans themselves, right? One last thing I'll say. This is a slightly, interesting point that not a lot of people have touched on. Garvey, was very open about one of the models he had for this project being Jewish Zionism in Palestine.
Absolutely.
And there's multiple times when Garvey says, look, if the Jews can have Palestine, why can't us blacks have Africa? The Yiddish press described Garvey as a black Herzl, referring to Theodore Herzl, right, the founder of Jewish Zionism. Harrison was not interested in these sort of grandiose dreams of Dukes of the Nile and all these titles that Garvey had created. Harrison believed that Africans had the right of self-determination and didn't need educated or westernized blacks to get free.
So I want you to pick up a further point, and that is, it can be argued that it's only with the coming of Black power that there emerged amongst African Americans a view that Africans had cultures that were worthy, so to speak. And that if we go back in time, then we're looking at a handful of people: Robeson, Harrison, Du Bois, Carter G. Woodson,
Schomburg,
and there's I can't think of a name right now, but very important person who actually lived in Liberia for a time, that they had respect for African cultures. Garvey, would it be fair to say that he's Anglophile and that he's going to bring British culture with him as he moves across Africa? But certainly he's got problems with jazz. I mean, he's got a lot of problems with organic African American expression, as well as his view of African culture. Was that also a flashpoint between he and Harrison?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, Garvey had this kind of this kind of admiration for European empires, right? It's almost like he wanted to be the Black Napoleon, right? He talked about having a Black empire on which the sun would never set, which is obviously a reference to the British Empire. He explicitly referenced the British Empire and Caesar's Rome as, what he was aiming for with this Black empire. Harrison, as an anti-imperialist, obviously had a very different vision of the meaning of new Negro politics and Black liberation. Harrison was talking about, founding a colored international so that the colonized peoples of the world could link up in a struggle against capitalism and imperialism and white supremacy. Garvey, unfortunately, I think emulated a lot of the kind of Eurocentric models of nationalism and sovereignty that were on offer in that day. I mean, in fact, when J.A. Rogers interviews Garvey in London in the 30s, Garvey's like, yeah, we were the first fascists. Mussolini took his lead from us, And so yeah, there's a lot of problematic aspects of Garvey's ideology, even though the Garvey movement was so influential. And certainly we have to say and give credit where it's due, Garveyism really inspired a whole generation of anti-colonial thinkers like Kwame Nkrumah and Jomo Kenyatta, both of Malcolm X's parents, right? Earl Little and Louise Little were both in the Garvey movement. So I don't want to discount the impact or the influence of Garveyism, but I do think there are powerful critiques of Marcus Garvey, the individual, which Harrison makes and which we need to really grapple with if we want to understand more deeply the kind of origins and trajectory that the Garvey movement ultimately took.
So let me get back to your book and Jeffrey Perry's work. In what ways does your work complement, and in what ways does it challenge and transcend the work that Perry's given us? And here I'm talking about the two biographies, not the collection of Harrison's writings. I know you're building, you're clearly building on Perry, but where are there some turns, some roads that you take that Perry didn't take, that you build out more? And are there any challenges, right?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. It's a question I've been hearing ever since I was a graduate student, right? Because Perry, being the only scholar that's written these books, like everyone's like, "What are you doing that's different from Perry? What are you adding?" So first off, I'll say again, what's that?
The free love.
Free love is one example of something that Perry mentions almost in passing, but does not explore systematically at all, nor has anybody else who's written about Harrison. I have a whole chapter called Black Free Love Politics and the Queer New Negro, precisely because it's such a powerful and generative dimension of Harrison's radicalism. But it's not just a matter of subject matter, like I'm covering areas of Harrison's thought that Perry didn't. It's also a matter of perspective, right? Because Perry, you know, for all the great work that he did, and certainly he put in decades of work to try to recover Harrison, and I wouldn't have known about Harrison, let alone started on the intellectual journey I've had with him, if it wasn't for Perry. But at the same time, you know, Perry, he's coming at Harrison from the perspective of an Irish American socialist and labor activist. So he's interested in Harrison's class radicalism and his anti-racism because Perry's, you know, looking to find resources to build the struggle against capitalism and white supremacy. And those are critical pieces of Harrison's thought. But that's not all that's there, right? I mean, for example, Harrison had a whole African identity. In fact, Harrison identified as an untamed, untamable African. Yeah. And I have a whole chapter about Harrison's relationship to Africa and African people, because as a person of African descent myself, I'm taking a Black and African angle of vision on Harrison, unapologetically so, which means that I'm more interested in Garveyism than Perry is, right? Perry is a bit dismissive toward Garveyism, right? Or offers a kind of typically standard, the standard kind of Marxist or white Marxist dismissal of Black nationalism in general, including Garveyism. But it's also a matter of like, how can people access Harrison, right? Because Perry, his 2 volumes are nearly 1,200 pages. The 2-volume biography is nearly 1,200 pages, not including footnotes. Right. So for me as a researcher, that's great. I was able to use Perry like a reference work. But for the general reader, 1,200 pages is a pretty steep hill to climb. And I think the danger is that less people will even read a 2-volume book that's that long, just because it's so cumbersome and tedious in some ways to get through. So mine is a single volume, right? It's one book that has a much more punchier and thematic kind of flow. So I have 9 chapters, each one on a different theme. And I think it's more digestible and more accessible because I'm really trying to write for a more general audience, and in ways that hopefully will inspire people, you know, to read with the kind of detail that Perry has provided. But at least, if not that, to give people a kind of, you know, one-shot sense of the significance and the analytical interpretation of Harrison that has been missing, even from an extremely detailed work like Perry's, given his own particular vantage point, and sort of positionality in terms of how he relates to Harrison.
Can you draw out the differences in political interpretation a bit more? And I guess what I'm trying to get at is that your phrase that Perry's 2 works are kind of like a reference book, that there's something sharper and more, not just more accessible, but something more useful to today's politics in your work.
Yeah. So, absolutely. Yeah. So Perry, what Perry does in that 2-volume biography is he basically tries to recount every single detail he could find about Harrison's life from start to finish, right? And so the analogy that I use in the book is like, if Harrison is a tree, right? Perry is looking at every little piece of bark on the tree, every little ant and bug that's crawling on the tree, right? Every leaf on the tree. It's extremely detailed and meticulous about Harrison's almost on a day-by-day. He's almost given a day-by-day account of Harrison's life. Now it's easy to get lost in that level of detail because some of it is just minutia that doesn't actually have a lot of bearing on the larger significance intellectually and politically of Harrison's life and legacy. So what I tried to do, instead of writing a traditional biography and trying to chronicle Harrison's every step from start to finish, which Perry has already done with a level of detail that no one will probably ever match, I came and said, all right, what we need is a work that interprets Harrison, right? That offers an analysis of his significance and his impact and his relationship to the Black radical tradition before, during, and after his time. And I think that's what makes the book a little more punchy and accessible, because I'm saying, look, okay, Harrison did this and this. Here's why it matters, right? Here's what Harrison did for the Socialist Party. Here's how he broke new ground, both in theory and practice, as a Black socialist, right? Here's what Harrison did for the project of radical internationalism, right? You have the internationalism of the Second International and the Third International, the Comintern, and then you have the Colored International, which Harrison is arguing for, right? A complement for the colonized world to the kind of Eurocentric internationalism of the white radicals in the Communist Party. So I'm showing Harrison's significance. I'm showing why it matters, and also how you apply Harrison's ideas today, right? Because if I tell you a very detailed breakdown of what Harrison ate for breakfast and lunch and dinner, that may be interesting on some level, but it's not necessarily going to inform what do we do now about the billionaire oligarchs in the world. And so my book tries to say, hey, Harrison was dealing with billionaire oligarchs, and he was able to take these very cogent arguments about the centrality of the working class and radical labor struggles, supporting the general strike, supporting sabotage, right, supporting industrial unionism like the IWW was calling for. That can inform how do we think about actually building or rebuilding a labor movement today. And same with so many other issues, right? Whether it's the imperialism of the First World War. Harrison called the First World War the White World War, right? Calling attention to the fact that it was white empires that were contending for who would rule over the darker races. This again is a useful kind of concept, because it reminds us that a lot of what's happening in terms of foreign policy is like we're on the path to World War III, right? And if we want to better understand how we need to or could potentially respond to the sort of creeping of World War III that we're seeing, it's useful to go back and look at, well, how did Black radicals deal with the First World War when this idea of World War, first came on the agenda? Same with race and class politics, right? One of the questions that has vexed Black radicals down to the present day is, do we put race first or class first? Well, if you want to understand that more deeply, it's useful to look at a moment when that question was perhaps maybe not the first time, but certainly one of the earliest moments where that question got posed so starkly. And the debate between Harrison and the Garvey movement, it could be, yeah. I mean, so looking at the debate between Harrison and A. Philip Randolph, right? When Randolph and Wilfred Domingo and Chandler Owen are basically attacking the Garvey movement, attacking the doctrine of race first, Harrison comes to the polemical defense of the race first doctrine, and of the UNIA, because he's editor of the Negro World, and he's learned a lesson the hard way that if white people in the Democratic Party of Woodrow Wilson are going to put race first, and if the white Republicans and Tuskegee machine of Booker T. Washington are also going to put white folks first, and if the Socialist Party,
Eugene Debs' famous statement that he said, socialism has nothing to offer the Negro, nothing special to offer the Negro. That foolishness, yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, forget about white conservatives and white liberals. Look at the white radicals like Debs, who, in many ways is an extraordinary labor leader, a really popular president for the Socialist Party, all the times that he ran. But yeah, as you said, he said, we have nothing special to offer the Negro because the class struggle is colorless. And we can't make special appeals to all the races, right? Never mind that the Socialist Party was making special appeal to Latvians and Poles and Lithuanians and Russians, and
it was organized on the basis of ethnic clubs.
Right.
European ethnic clubs.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So yeah, I think that that's another thing that, frankly, leftist, socialist, communist, Marxist folks, I think just need to be honest about Debs, right? Like, there's nothing to gain from pretending that Debs had great race politics. There's a lot more to gain from looking at his weaknesses and saying, what can we learn from this? Right? What does this teach us about, the white left, the white Marxists that we were talking about earlier, and how they seem to be willing to call for revolution against capitalism and the state, but then they're like, oh, we don't need to say anything. We have nothing special to offer about lynching and disfranchisement and anti-Black, massacres that are happening all over the country, right? I mean, how do you remain silent on that question? I think we can grow and learn from Debs, but not unless we're honest about his serious, politics, serious limitations of his race politics.
Yeah. To put it, no pun pun included, is colorblindness.
Right. Exactly.
So this discussion that we just had, I really appreciate the thoughtfulness and the depth of your answers. But I think that if we don't say something about gender now, it's a misrepresentation of the conversation, because you have spoken very clearly and strongly to the role of gender earlier. So it would be the question of race, class, and gender and their dialectical interaction. I don't want to use the word intersection, because that leads us to a kind of liberal mathematical formula as opposed to dialectics, right? So,
yeah, well,
go ahead and respond to that.
Yeah, sure. So one of the things I try to do in the book is to show Harrison in motion and in movement, not just with whatever particular social movement it is, but all the figures, including the women that are often present. So one of the key influences on Harrison, or key forerunners, I could say, and influences, is Ida B. Wells, because of the anti-lynching crusade that she waged, right? When Harrison forms the Liberty League, or when he's chairing the Liberty Congress in DC, and they're pushing the federal government to adopt anti-lynching legislation in the midst of the so-called war for democracy, in which, Southern African Americans have no democracy, that's building directly off the work of Ida B. Wells, right? One of Harrison's greatest mentors was Frances Reynolds Keyser, who was the director of the White Rose Home for Colored Girls. This was basically like a boarding house and stop for migrants coming to New York City, young, Black women and girls who migrating either from the Jim Crow South or from the Caribbean to Harlem, making sure they could get a job, making sure they could have a place to stay if they needed it, right? Harrison was working in the White Rose Home. This was a Black women's club work, right? Frances Reynolds Keyser was one of the key figures in the National Association for Colored Women, right? Harrison was supporting women's suffrage, particularly Black women's suffrage, as a part of his activism amongst Black women. And so there's a lot of places where I try to show, Harrison's in relationship to not just Black women, but even white women, right? Because there's white women radicals that he's working with, people like Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, of the Industrial Workers of the World, one of the great sort of radical white women labor leaders. Emma Goldman was another person, that Harrison was kind of in the same circles with, white radicals, right? But then also I have a little bit of a critique of Harrison on gender, because, there are moments where it seems like although he worked with a lot of Black activist women, he celebrated the National Association of Colored Women and the people he met within that milieu. He supported, Black women's right to vote. There are other places where it seems like he has a more masculinist sort of conception, right? So, for example, his book.
You suggest a chauvinist conception?
Not exactly, but perhaps a blind spot in particular ways, looking back on it from where we are now. So, for example, his book, When Africa Awakes, it's like a collection of 50-something of his essays on a wide range of topics. There's only one out of those 50 essays that is about Black women. And it's not about Black women's agency or political leadership or intellectual contribution in life. It's about how beautiful they are, right? Which, okay, yeah, true, but
certainly that was an interest he had.
Right. But he could have said more. He could have devoted more pieces to this question, and in different ways. So, so that's part of my answer. The other part of my answer, though, is Harrison is doing something that is so profound for gender, not just gender, but gender and sexuality, in the way he crystallized a Black free love politics and placed this critique of compulsory monogamy alongside a critique of colonialism and white supremacy and capitalism and imperialism, that I think we haven't even begun to reckon with the meaning of that, right? Because one of the things that Audre Lorde says in her essay on the suppression of the erotic is that part of how oppression works is that it undermines any resource that oppressed people can draw on for inspiration and for resistance. And she's talking about the suppression of women's erotic energy and erotic power. But what she says applies equally to Black men in this period, because lynching oftentimes included castration, which is a direct attack on Black men's erotic power and manhood. And so, I mean, it's amazing because in a context of church repression of sexuality, right, the church had, like it still does, had a number of prudish and sex negative, views that it put out. In addition to that, and state repression, right, because you have the Comstock laws, you have the criminalization of all manner of things sexual, and then, of course, lynching and castration, anti-Black sexual distortion repression. In the face of all that, to come out as a Black free lover and to do so as a non-citizen, right, where you could be deported at any moment, much like we're seeing today, that's an extraordinary sort of risky and radical thing to do. And we still haven't even begun to reckon with the meaning of that. And so that's why I devoted a whole chapter in the book, because I think there's a lot more for us, those of us who identify with the Black radical tradition. I think there's a lot more work for us to do in interrogating regime of compulsory monogamy and how that actually holds back and limits our erotic power and potential. Particularly when you look at, for example, sexualities in Africa before colonization, where you find a wide range of erotic energy exchange traditions, right? Oftentimes the Dagara people, for example, the Dagara people saw what we think of in the Western frame as LGBT people. They saw them as gatekeepers, meaning they had the keys to the gates between this world and the spirit world, or one foot in both worlds. They were seen by the community as spiritually elevated. They were able to resolve conflicts in the community, right? They were kind of these masculine, feminine energy balancers, and celebrated and respected in the community in particular ways. That's just one of many, many examples we could talk about that gets lost under the regime of homophobia that is imposed by colonization and slavery, and which wipes out the many sexualities and sort of erotic power that is natural to humans, particularly indigenous folks all over the world who have had other ways, again, besides monogamy, of relating to sex and erotic energy and love. Because at the end of the day, we can't have Black political liberation or Black economic liberation without Black sexual liberation.
Yeah, I would concur. I want to get us to the questions. Great conversation. I really appreciate the thoughtfulness and the depth and the new vistas that you open up. But we would be remiss if we don't get to some of these questions. So I've got something from Matthew Siegfried, and he says, Harrison question, and sorry if it was already answered. What was Harrison's relation with the Crusader magazine and the Messenger and his own journal all being published at the same time?
Great question. So Harrison crystallized a whole lot of things, by which I mean he was able to synthesize elements together to make something new that became like a new form that others could then build off of, right? So one of the things that he crystallizes is a Black radical newspaper called The Voice in 1917, as he's also founding the Liberty League, right? The Voice was basically like the organ of the Liberty League, or the newspaper of the Liberty League. And The Voice really set a standard that for a whole new generation of Black publications and Black radical papers. So after The Voice in 1917, the very next year, or later that year, actually, The Messenger gets founded by Afield Randolph and Chandler Owen. who were both open about the fact that Harrison was the father of Harlem radicalism, and that they built off his example. In 1918, Garvey decides to found his own newspaper called The Negro World. In 1919, Cyril Briggs founds The Crusader. In 1920, Wilfred Domingo founds The Emancipator. So Harrison set off this whole chain. He set an example that set off this whole new generation, the new Negro movement generation, to have their own papers, because they all felt that there was a need for something more radical than what existed before. I'm talking about, William Monroe Trotter's Guardian in Boston, the Crisis magazine that Du Bois was editing for the NAACP, right? The Amsterdam News that is in Harlem, the Chicago Defender, right? Like, there are these papers that were not as radical as what the new Negro movement people wanted. And Harrison is a key figure in sort of setting an example by crystallizing something that other people would find useful.
Good. So here's another question. And boy, it's also from Matthew Siegfried. And he begins it with another question. When Harrison was confronting the SP's limitations in 1911, 1912, William Haywood was running an insurgent left campaign for leadership. Did Harrison have a relationship with Big Bill Haywood?
Absolutely. Yeah. So there's a picture in my book. I might even be able to find it. There's a picture of Harrison with Big Bill Haywood and with Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who were two of the sort of leading labor radicals in the IWW and in the Socialist Party. And in 1913, the Patterson Silk Strike. Here's the picture I'm talking about. I don't know if it's going to come out too well, but you can see Harrison here, on the side in the front row. He's the only Black speaker in this group. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn is in the middle. Big Bill Haywood is on the right. Harrison was the only Black speaker to address these rallies in support of the striking silk workers. 20,000 silk workers went on strike in Paterson, New Jersey, 1913. And so Harrison is in the milieu with people like Big Bill Haywood, supporting strikes that even the Socialist Party at that time were not endorsing, because the Socialist Party, I'll just give you the quick version, which is the Socialist Party was, the leadership of the party was mostly moderate and white and middle class. And they didn't necessarily like strikes, especially large scale strikes that they couldn't control. And so Harrison basically goes to the strikers, supports the strikers, says, I'm going to be with you, whether the Socialist Party is here or not. We as socialists should be with you and should be listening to you, not trying to tell you what to do or how to conduct the strike. And so Harrison was very much celebrated as somebody who was in the same circles and on the same picket lines and strike rallies with Big Bill Haywood and other labor radicals of that age.
So we've talked about virtually every radical Black person in that period, with the exception of Lucy Parsons. Did Hubert Henry Harrison and Lucy Parsons, certainly the IWW would have been common space. Any interactions there?
I am not aware of any direct interactions between Harrison and Lucy Parsons. I mean, the IWW, like a lot of people, and like the Socialist Party, kind of got really messed up by the war. World War I was a crucible for the left and for progressive forces everywhere, because there was so much state repression, the criminalization of dissent. I mean, the Socialist Party split, right? It was anti-war socialists who broke away to form the Communist Party in the aftermath of World War I. Because they realized they were in an organization with a lot of folks who were pro-war and pro-imperialists, much like happened for socialist parties all around the world. So the IWW doesn't really last much longer as a real force after World War I in the way that it was before. But one other thing I can say about Lucy Parsons that's interesting is that in my research on the chapter on free love, I found that she had an argument that basically said, okay, this whole free love thing sounds nice, but what about the children who are going to result from, from these interactions and this kind of freewheeling, romantic or sexual love style. And I think that argument has had some water in the 19th century when Lucy Parsons made it.
Yeah.
But contraception and access to contraception became much more widespread in the early 20th century, thanks to the work of a number of white women activists who really pushed to decriminalize contraception and actually create access to birth control. So I think that takes a lot of the wind out of the sails of Lucy Parsons' argument. And Harrison, as one of the first Black figures to explicitly and publicly call for the decriminalization of contraception, in some ways is responding to that concern that some of the folks in the 19th century, even radical Black and Native women like Lucy Parsons, had some reason to be concerned with.
Yeah. So, Brother Brian, I want to thank you for gracing us with a superb, detailed discussion about the new Negro movement era centered around Herbert Henry Harrison. And I'd like to ask you now if there are any final comments or announcements you want to make, and to be tight, because we try and keep a tight 90-minute program. My producer's going crazy right now. So any announcements or final comments?
Yeah, I mean, the last thing I want to share is that I've worked on this book for over a decade. It is my testament, and I really want to invite people to think of it that way, because you're not just buying a book, like you're buying a piece of my heart and soul. When you get this, it contains not just the years of scholarly research and reflection and revision, but also the years of activism on the ground that goes all the way back to my very first protest in 2004 against the Iraq War and against the U.S. backing of the overthrow of President Aristide in Haiti for the second time. And so it's a multidimensional book, and it's one that I think everybody can learn from, right? No matter what your brand of political radicalism or progressive thinking is. You will be challenged by this book, but it's a good one. It's a good challenge. Harrison is challenging, and that's part of why we haven't had more work on him in general, is he's a rare bird. He doesn't fit easily in any one pigeonhole or category. But I'm proud of the work. I'm excited to share it with the world. And yeah, I just really want folks to get the book and read the book. And I'll be hopefully coming soon to a city near you, because I'm in the midst of a book tour and always planning more events for the book tour. I'm going to be in the DMV at the end of this month, in Baltimore, and in DC with book events. I'll be in St. Louis, for the OSWAD conference. I'll be in Atlanta for the ASALA conference. Eventually I'll get to New York, because Harrison lived and worked his whole adult life in Harlem. And I would love to do, I'm planning to do book events at the Schomburg and maybe some other places in New York, and others, right? So, and other locations. So yeah, if you are interested in hosting a book event or helping publicize a book event, that would be really awesome. But also just if you can just buy the book, and buy a piece of my heart and soul, that would also be really helpful, because I don't have a professional book publicist or agent. So I'm really relying on sort of word of mouth, a more grassroots kind of marketing and publicity strategy. And I have a book trailer, which I wanted to just drop into the chat, because
please put it in the chat.
Yeah, I wanted to, because it's a nice piece of just introduction to the book that people can share very easily. It's an Instagram video.
It's professionally done.
Yes,
and it will give you a quick overview of the book. And if I don't stop now, I'm going to have to eliminate my producer.
I can't I can't seem to post the link to the trailer. So what I'll do instead, I don't know why. So what I'll just do instead is refer people to my website. It's briankwoba.com, BrianKwoba.com. If you click on media, you'll see the book trailer is the very first thing that pops up.
Thank you again, Brian. This was wonderful. It is an extraordinary piece of work. I urge you to purchase the book, and let me now remove us